Zipporah was the Midianite wife of Moses. We read that in Exodus 2, verse 21. Not much is known about her except that her actions saved the life of her husband Moses at a time when God was about to kill Moses. Take a look at Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 through 26. Her story gets little play in contemporary Bible studies, but she, like so many wives today, stepped in to cover for her husband when he failed to carry out his God-given responsibilities in the family. Moses holds an esteemed place in the Bible. He was singled out from among the Hebrew children to be spared the death sentence that had been issued by an Egyptian king. That's Exodus 1, 15 and 16. He was miraculously raised by the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh, Exodus 1, 5 through 10. He escaped punishment for killing an abusive Egyptian by fleeing to the land of Midian, where he lived for 40 years. Read Exodus 2:15 and Acts 7:30. During his time in Midian, Moses became familiar with Mount Horeb, which is also known as Mount Sinai, where later he would receive the Ten Commandments, Exodus 3:1 and Exodus 19 and 20. Not only did Moses lead God's chosen people out of bondage, the book of Exodus records significant teachings of the Hebrew nation that occurred under Moses' leadership. During the ministry of Jesus, Moses reappeared at the mountaintop transfiguration, see Luke 9:30, and during the tribulation at the end of time, a witness resembling Moses is scheduled to once again appear on earth, read Revelation 11, verses 3 through 11. But at the earliest stages of Moses' celebrated ministry, he was on the brink of being killed by God, Exodus 4, verse 14. Fortunately, that's when Zipporah, the Midianite wife of Moses, stepped in to save Moses' life. Her story is worthy of some note. Moses was a reluctant participant in God's plan of action to save his people from centuries of slavery. As Moses was tending his father-in-law's sheep on Mount Horeb, he saw a bush burning. The flame was persistent, yet the bush was not being consumed, Exodus 3:2. Moses' curiosity was piqued. As he ventured close to the flame, God called Moses by name and instructed him to remove his sandals because he was entering holy ground. That's Exodus 3, verse 5. God identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, causing Moses to turn his head away because he was afraid to look directly upon the one true God, Exodus 3:6. That's when God laid out the mission he had in mind. He acknowledged having heard the misery of his people in Egypt, and he had plans to rescue them. That's Exodus 3, verses 7 and 8. And God's plan would be carried out by Moses and would require Moses to directly confront the Egyptian Pharaoh. That's Exodus 3, verse 10. Moses, understandably, balked at the assignment that God had in mind. Moses protested, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" That's Exodus 3, verse 11. God assured Moses that God would be there with Moses, but Moses still resisted. God provided signs for Moses to use: a staff that would become a snake, leprosy that would be instantaneously disappeared, water that would become blood. Yet Moses tested God's patience by arguing that he was not eloquent. By then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, but God nevertheless appointed Moses' brother, Aaron, to be Moses' mouthpiece. That's Exodus 4, verses 1 through 17. Once Moses and his family began the journey back to Egypt to carry out God's rescue mission, God continued to instruct Moses. But Moses apparently had failed to circumcise his son Gershom. Gershom had been born in Midian and was given the name meaning "I am a foreigner," Exodus 2, verse 22. Separated from the Hebrew people and customs, Moses, for whatever reason, apparently had overlooked his duty to have his son circumcised as an infant, as was required for all Israelite males. That's Genesis 17, 9 through 14. Scripture says, during the trip to Egypt, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. Exodus 4:24. Moses' wife, Zipporah, then took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and presented the tissue to Moses, saying, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." That's Exodus 4:25. Before pursuing the Lord's work, Moses had to learn absolute obedience to God's mandates. And Zipporah, as wife to Moses, stepped in to perform the task of circumcising their son when her husband had failed to do so. Zipporah had married into a family line that required blood sacrifice in the form of infant circumcision, which later would involve blood sacrifice in the form of the Passover, and later would require blood sacrifice of Christ for his family of believers. This obscure passage in Scripture reinforces the point that we must strive to be obedient to God's directions. We all fall short of that from time to time, but this passage also demonstrates how a wife can sometimes step in when the man of the household fails in his duty. Men, as heads of household, bear the responsibility to be the spiritual leaders in their families. Read Ephesians 5, verses 22 through 27. In today's culture, men too often fall short of meeting their duty as spiritual leaders in the family. Frequently, for the sake of the family, women have to step in to be the example and to set the tone for godly living. Being the spiritual leader requires that we make faith a priority, that we demonstrate fidelity to God through prayer and meditation on Scripture, that we model Christ-like selflessness, and that we lovingly encourage others. The mantle of responsibility for spiritual leadership rests on the male, but is often picked up, of necessity, by women when the men fall short. So as we consider this obscure passage about Zipporah saving Moses' life, reflect on these questions for introspection, if you will. Question number 1, what family leadership role do you perceive to be the most challenging for men today? Question number 2, what examples have you observed of women having to step in to fill the male's responsibilities of spiritual leadership in the family? And question number 3, how can you build up men to encourage them in their spiritual leadership roles? Breakdown of the family unit in today's culture has had devastating effects. The family, according to Scripture, begins when a man leaves his father and mother and joins his wife as a family unit. That's Genesis 2, verse 24. The husband and wife relationship is designed to mirror Christ's relationship with the church, Ephesians 5, 22 and 23. But forces for social change have undermined the stability of families today, often resulting in the absence of a male head of household to lead the family in godly living. The greatest challenge for men today may simply be to show up for their family. When the male head of household is absent or is ignoring his spiritual leadership responsibilities, the woman has to step in to fulfill that role. Zipporah likely was not the first woman to perform the job of her husband, and certainly will not be the last. The absence of male family heads as is prevalent today. As a result, we see women having to become the spiritual head of the household, praying, reading Scripture, promoting godly living for their families and as an example for their families. The role of Christians includes encouraging one another to live out the Scriptures. Read Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. That means supporting the women who are filling the responsibilities of absent men, and it means speaking with men about showing up for their families, fulfilling their God-given roles to be the spiritual leaders and heads of household. The story of Zipporah reminds us of this human condition and reminds us of our roles in living out God's plan.